The arrival on Zira. The sun was a scorching, brilliant star that hung like a merciless god over the planet Zira. The ultraviolet radiation it emitted was so intense that even the hardiest of beings couldn't withstand its burning wrath. But Anthony Walker, the human explorer, stood alone on the surface of Zira, unscathed and unmoved by the blistering rays that should have incinerated him in seconds. His skin glistened with beads of sweat, his expression calm as though he were simply walking through a summer day, oblivious to the hostile world surrounding him. The armored transport that had just arrived with Commander Varys and his team hovered behind him, providing a false sense of protection from the sun's destructive power. Inside, the Orions, an advanced, isolationist alien species, were all witnessing the impossible. The transport's external cameras broadcasted the scene to their central command, and the footage was nothing short of extraordinary. Varys, the commander of the Orion military unit, stared at the live feed in utter disbelief. He had read the reports, studied human biology, and even learned of their resilience on previous missions, but nothing prepared him for the sight of Anthony Walker standing confidently on Zira's surface, seemingly unaffected by the planet's lethal solar radiation. For the Orions, who had built their civilization around the need to stay hidden and protected from such sun, the sight was more than a scientific anomaly. It was a challenge to everything they knew about survival. As the transport's engines hummed softly, Varys clenched his fists in frustration. This human's survival was an insult to the very foundation of Orion existence. Their civilization had lived for millennia in the shadow of Zira's cruel sun. Their technology developed to help them survive within underground cities and shielded domes. And yet, here was this outsider, this primitive human, standing on the surface of Zira like it was a stroll through a park. Impossible, Varys muttered under his breath, but the words didn't carry any weight. What he saw before him was undeniable. Anthony Walker was living proof of something that should not exist in Orion belief. Varys' mind struggled to rationalize the situation. It couldn't be right. This human had to be an anomaly. He couldn't possibly represent humanity as a whole. This single human being might have a mutation, an ability that defied all known science. But his instincts told him otherwise. Humans were resilient. They were adaptable, and their potential for survival was beyond anything he had ever seen. If this human was not a freak of nature, then Varys feared what it might mean for his species, for their plans, and for their future. Squads 1 and 2 converge on the alien's location. Varys snapped over the transport's comms. His voice, usually cool and controlled, betrayed a hint of emotion, an emotion he hated to acknowledge. Fear. Capture him alive if possible. If he resists, terminate with extreme prejudice. His order was met with swift obedience, and the Orion soldiers, cloaked in their heavy environmental suits, quickly disembarked from the transport. Their mission was clear: capture the human and bring him back for questioning. They had to learn the secret behind his resistance to Zira's radiation and figure out how to replicate or neutralize it before any other species could use it against them. As the soldiers made their way across the desert, Varys couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was unfolding before him. If what he had seen so far was any indication, this human, this Anthony Walker, could change the course of history. If humanity truly had the ability to survive in conditions that no other species could endure, then the Orions were no longer at the top of the food chain. And Varys knew what that meant. Meanwhile, Anthony stood calmly in the center of the barren landscape, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had been sent to Zira as part of an exploration mission, a test of human adaptability to the harshest environments in the galaxy. The last thing he expected was to become the center of such attention. He knew the Orions were watching him. He could feel their eyes on him, even through the advanced optics of their transport's cameras. But instead of fear or anxiety, a sense of quiet determination filled him. This was what he had trained for, what humanity had trained for. It was a test of endurance, of adaptability. Humans were survivors, born from the ashes of their own planet's destruction. No radiation, no hostile alien race, no planetary challenge could ever break them. His mind wandered to the long history of human struggle and survival. Earth had faced extinction-level events many times over. Natural disasters, pandemics, and even the rise and fall of civilizations had tried to destroy humanity. But time and time again, humans had adapted, rebuilt, and thrived. It was in their DNA, their spirit. The challenges on Zira were just another test, and Anthony Walker was proof that humanity could overcome anything. As the Orion soldiers approached, Anthony knew that they wouldn't understand him or his people. To them, he was just a puzzle to be solved, a mystery to be unraveled. They wouldn't see the human spirit, the unyielding will that had carried humanity across the stars. But that didn't matter. He was here to represent humanity, to show the galaxy that humans were no longer a fledgling species, but a force to be reckoned with. The soldiers reached him within moments. Their leader, a tall and imposing figure with armored plating and a helmet that concealed most of his features, stepped forward. "You are coming with us," he stated coldly, his voice amplified by the speaker in his helmet. "You will answer our questions. Do not resist." Anthony regarded the Orion commander with a steady gaze. His voice was calm and unwavering when he replied, "I'm not going anywhere with you." The tension in the air was palpable, but Anthony had no intention of giving up his freedom. He knew how to survive, how to negotiate, and how to outthink his enemies. His mission wasn't just about proving humanity's survival. It was about asserting that humans were capable of thriving on their own terms. Varys observed from a distance, his anger rising. "We don't have time for this," he muttered. "Take him." The soldiers moved quickly, but Anthony was ready. He had expected this moment, anticipated the confrontation. With swift movements, he dodged the first soldier's attempt to grab him, using his environment to his advantage. The sun may have been a deadly force, but it was also his ally in this fight. The glare of the sunlight, combined with the terrain's harshness, gave him the upper hand. Varys' frustration mounted as he watched the human effortlessly outmaneuver his best soldiers. His species was strong, their technology advanced, but they had never encountered anything like this. A human. One single human. Defying them so easily was a challenge Varys wasn't ready to accept. But he had no choice but to proceed. This was no longer about capturing a trespasser. This was about understanding the greatest threat to Orion's sovereignty. As the standoff continued, the desert landscape seemed to stretch endlessly, a vast and unforgiving backdrop to the unfolding drama. Anthony knew the Orions had underestimated humanity, but he was about to show them just how wrong they were. The tensions rise. The sun above Zira blazed down relentlessly, bathing the entire desert landscape in a golden, harsh glow. The air was thick with heat, and the ground shimmered with the distortion of waves caused by the intensity of the radiation from the sun. Yet Anthony Walker, human explorer, stood unscathed, his feet firmly planted on the burning soil. His gaze was unwavering, scanning the horizon, taking in the alien world around him, while the Orion soldiers continued to close in. Despite the intense pressure, Anthony remained calm, his posture relaxed, but there was no doubt in his mind that he had just made a powerful statement. The Orions, for all their technological might and military prowess, had underestimated the strength and resolve of humanity. They had never witnessed someone like him. Humanity's extraordinary adaptability to the most hostile environments was something beyond their comprehension. Commander Varys observed the unfolding scene with mounting frustration. The human's ability to move with such confidence in Zira's lethal sunlight was not only a scientific anomaly, but a humiliation to everything the Orions had believed about the universe. Varys had always viewed the universe through the lens of Orion superiority, and to see a human standing on the surface of a planet that was supposed to be a death trap for any being from a temperate world was deeply unsettling. "What are you waiting for?" Varys snapped over the comms to his soldiers, his voice dripping with impatience. "Take him now. We can't let him leave here alive. Do not underestimate him." His survival is an insult to everything we have worked for. But Anthony Walker wasn't backing down. As the soldiers advanced, he knew that his situation was rapidly escalating. He had to think quickly. They were trying to capture him, to imprison him, and figure out what made him different from the other species they had encountered. He could feel the weight of their hostile intentions pressing down on him, but he wasn't afraid. He had come to Zero with a purpose, to prove humanity's resilience, and he wasn't about to let these aliens stop him now. The moment the first soldier lunged at him, Anthony reacted with the grace of someone who had been trained for moments like this. His body twisted as he dodged the soldier's grasp, using the desert terrain to his advantage. He kicked off the sand, propelling himself forward with a surprising burst of speed for someone who appeared to be unarmed and outnumbered. He had no intention of being captured. The Orions had miscalculated if they thought they could handle a human with no regard for his will to survive. Varys watched with growing incredulity as Anthony weaved and dodged, effortlessly evading the soldiers' attempts to subdue him. His movements were almost fluid, more like a dancer than someone under attack. The human was using their own desperation against them, employing the kind of street-level combat that the Orions hadn't expected from someone they thought of as primitive. The commander's frustration reached a boiling point as he issued another order. "Don't give him the chance to escape. Bring him down." Now the soldiers, now moving in unison, attempted a more coordinated effort, surrounding Anthony and cutting off his escape routes. They thought they had him cornered, but they underestimated just how far Anthony was willing to go to remain free. In that moment, Anthony realized something crucial. The Orions had never truly encountered an enemy like humanity. Their society had turned inward, building an insular world centered on self-preservation, and now they were faced with an invader who represented everything they feared: adaptability, ingenuity, and a will to survive that was unmatched. The Orions had never been tested in such a way, and it was clear they were struggling to comprehend how to handle this threat. But Anthony wasn't just fighting for his freedom in this moment. He was fighting for all of humanity. He had come to Zira as a representative of the human race, and he couldn't let this opportunity slip away. If he was captured, it would not only mean the loss of his life, it would mean that the Orions would have access to humanity's greatest secret. The knowledge of human resilience to solar radiation could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. It could tip the scales in favor of the Orions, or worse, other more dangerous species could learn of it. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Anthony made his move. He darted toward a nearby ridge, using the shifting sand as cover, and within moments, he disappeared from sight. The Orions scrambled, trying to reorient themselves to track his movement, but they were too slow. The human had managed to outmaneuver them once again. Commander Varys, standing atop the transport and watching the scene unfold, clenched his fists in anger. This cannot be happening. He's only one human. How is he doing this? But the answer was clear to anyone who had studied humanity for long enough. Humans were capable of extraordinary feats under pressure. They adapted quickly, thinking on their feet, and their resilience was something no amount of technology could predict. The Orions had underestimated human resourcefulness, and now they were paying the price. Varys' mind raced. This human was unlike anything the Orions had ever faced. His survival wasn't just a matter of biology. It was a reflection of something deeper within humanity, something the Orions couldn't quantify. It was a strength of spirit, a drive to endure, and an unwillingness to yield. It was humanity's greatest strength, their sheer will to exist, to survive, to thrive. As the soldiers continued to search for him, Varys gave an order for the transport to be moved closer to the search area. He needed a better vantage point. He had to understand how this human thought. He had to understand what made him tick. Meanwhile, Anthony, hidden behind the ridge, took a moment to catch his breath. He could hear the Orions searching, their heavy footsteps drawing nearer. His heart raced, but his mind remained calm. This was what he had trained for. This was the moment that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. He had to win, not just for his survival, but for the future of mankind. The ground beneath his feet shook slightly as the transport began to move closer, sending vibrations through the sand. Anthony took one last glance at the desert around him, realizing just how fragile this situation had become. But he wasn't going to go down without a fight. He was going to show the Orions that humans were not to be underestimated. The game was on. The unlikely alliance. The sun's rays beat down relentlessly, casting long, sharp shadows across the barren expanse of Zira. The desert was an unforgiving place. Its scorching heat and blinding brightness created a world where life seemed impossible. Yet here stood Anthony Walker, unscathed and unbowed, his body standing firm against the odds. Hidden amongst the dunes, he remained out of sight from the Orion soldiers who were desperately searching for him. He had escaped their grasp for now, but he knew it wouldn't be long before they found him. The Orions had the advantage of technology and sheer numbers. He was a single human, isolated on an alien world. He had only his wits, his resilience, and his knowledge of survival. But those things, he knew, were enough. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of something burning in the distance. Anthony squinted, peering over the ridge where the desert met the horizon. The Orion transport was now closer, its massive engines churning the sand as it slowly advanced toward his location. The Orions had come prepared, and their search was relentless. But Anthony had one thing they did not: an intimate understanding of how to survive in hostile environments. He had been trained to think in moments like this, to adapt to whatever came his way. Still, it was only a matter of time before the Orions closed in on him. The planet's harsh conditions were working in his favor for now, but the longer he remained out of sight, the more likely they were to find him. He had no desire to be taken captive. He needed to get away, back to his ship, back to humanity's foothold in the galaxy. The Orions had underestimated him, but that didn't mean he could rest on his laurels. As he moved further into the shifting sands, something caught his eye. A shadow, large and looming, appeared in the distance. It wasn't the shadow of an Orion soldier, but something much larger. It was the silhouette of the transport, but something was different. The way it was moving, the tension in the air, it seemed to be responding to something in a way that made Anthony pause. He didn't have long to think. The Orion search parties were closing in from all sides, and his time was running out. But just as he was about to move again, a series of blinding flashes lit up the sky. A massive shockwave reverberated across the desert, knocking Anthony off his feet and sending him tumbling to the ground. The force of the blast nearly knocked the wind out of him. And when he opened his eyes, he could see the source of the explosion in the distance. The protective shield around an Orion settlement had failed, the energy barrier flickering and collapsing under the sudden wave of solar radiation. Zira's sun, unpredictable and merciless, had sent forth a powerful flare, a surge of deadly energy that had disabled the entire region's shield systems. For a brief moment, there was silence. The air was thick with static, the sound of distant alarms ringing in the background, the ground trembling beneath Anthony's feet. He rose shakily to his feet, his mind racing. The Orions had been struck by the flare. They weren't invincible. Their technological superiority, their reliance on their shields and domes, none of it had protected them from the force of Zira's violent solar storms. The transport hovered above, now fully aware of the impending danger. Anthony's survival instinct kicked in as he realized that the fate of both he and the Orions was suddenly entwined. Their situation was no longer one of enemy versus enemy. It had transformed into something far more urgent. The flare had begun to melt the outer layers of the protective domes, rendering them useless against the radiation. Without thinking, Anthony dashed toward the nearest shelter. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to act so swiftly, but he knew that the only way to escape the radiation was to take cover with the Orions. The flare would devastate their entire base, and if he wanted to survive, he needed to act fast. But even as he ran, he knew he had to make a choice: escape and leave the Orions to their fate, or risk his life to try to save them. The ground shook beneath him again, this time more violently. Anthony dove into a trench, seeking shelter as the deadly radiation from the flare continued to wash over the planet's surface. He looked up, his heart pounding, to see the Orion transport plummeting toward the surface. The shockwave had destabilized its flight path, and it was going to crash. A horrible realization struck him. If the transport crashed, they would all be stranded, Orions and humans alike, on a planet with no shelter, no defenses, and no way of surviving Zira's hostile conditions. But there was something else in his mind now, a sense of responsibility. He had come to Zira for a reason. And no matter how much the Orions had challenged him, this wasn't just about survival anymore. He had the chance to make a difference. As the transport descended, he saw the chaos unfold. Soldiers scrambled in every direction, trying to regain control of their transport. Vari's voice rang out over the comms, commanding his troops to take cover. It was clear that the Orions hadn't prepared for a catastrophe of this magnitude. Without hesitation, Anthony made his way toward the wreckage. He knew it was a dangerous move, but it was one he had to make. As he approached the crash site, the ground around him trembled, the burning heat of the flare still radiating in waves. The transport had landed with a violent thud, its massive form embedded in the sand. The soldiers were dazed but alive. The crash had damaged their equipment, but they were still a threat. Anthony's heart pounded in his chest as he approached Varys, who was emerging from the wreckage, his once pristine armor now scorched and dented. The commander looked up in disbelief as Anthony approached. There was no animosity in the air now, only the weight of their shared plight. "Why did you come?" Varys demanded, his voice trained but steady. He was clearly struggling to reconcile the reality of the situation. "I came to survive," Anthony replied. "But now, I came to help. You're not going to make it if we don't work together. You need shelter, and I know where we can find it." Varys looked at him for a long moment, his fierce demeanor softening slightly as he surveyed the destruction around him. For the first time, Anthony saw doubt in the Orion commander's eyes. It was clear the Orions had never been in a situation where they needed to depend on anyone else. "Why would you help us?" Varys asked. "Because humanity isn't just about surviving. It's about overcoming," Anthony said. "We've always fought for our survival, but we've learned that working together is the only way forward." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, with a heavy sigh, Varys nodded. The realization was dawning on him. He had no choice. He needed Anthony's help if they were going to survive. "Then let's make it happen," Varys said. "Lead the way." And so, under the burning sun of Zira, an unlikely alliance was formed. The Orions and the humans would need to work together to survive the planet's punishing radiation. In that moment, the tension between the two species began to shift, transforming into something new, a fragile cooperation forged in the fires of necessity.